Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into a neighborhood where the trees still remember the names of the children who vanished beneath them. The house at the end of Broken Elm Street is supposed to be empty. Everyone says so. But tonight as I turn onto the cracked cul-de-sac, the attic lights flicker on like blinking eyes. I freeze. That place hasn't had electricity in years. Three boys disappeared here in 1989. Triplets, identical, 7 years old, no ransom note, no witnesses, not even a broken latch on the gate. One minute they were laughing in the front yard, the next silence. You might not survive this story with your sense of reality intact. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing who's out there with me at this hour. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soft noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. It started with the attic lights, but for me, it started even earlier when I moved into my aunt's old place just 2 doors down. The first night I couldn't sleep, not because it was creepy, which it was, but because of the heat. June in Texas sticks to your skin like grief. I stepped outside to cool off, walked to the edge of the yard, and that's when I saw them. Not the boys, the lights, just a flicker in the attic window of 214 Broken Elm Street. And I swear I heard something. A kind of childish giggle, soft and playful, riding the wind. The thing is, that house hasn't had power since 1993. I told myself it was a heat mirage. You know, like when pavement gets wavy. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day I walked over. I expected graffiti, maybe some raccoons, but the place was still. The mailbox still had a name, Cooper. The porch had that sagging, sighing look old wood gets when it's been waiting too long. And beneath the elm tree in the front yard, a faint outline in the dirt, like something had once been there. Maybe a bike, maybe three. I don't scare easy, but I do get curious. And sometimes those are the same thing. I spent the afternoon in the garage where the heat was worse, like it had thickened the air. There was a warped wall panel behind some busted shelving. It didn't match the rest of the framing. That's always a sign something's hiding. I grabbed a crowbar, and that's when I remembered something my dad used to say: people don't bury secrets in the yard anymore. They bury them in drywall. He was a contractor, a tired one, always with some dusty wisdom that sounded too poetic for his beer belly and flannel. Anyway, back to the wall. The first crack I made in it released a smell. Not rot, not mold, just oldness, dust and heat, and something that had been sealed off. Behind the wall was a narrow void, big enough to fit a child, I thought, before I could stop myself. But it wasn't a body, it was a box. A wooden crate, gray with age, nailed shut but sloppily, like someone had rushed to forget. I pulled it out. It groaned like a secret. Inside, a fire truck toy missing wheels, a tangled mess of string yo-yos, a laminated library card, name Evan Cooper, and at the bottom a photo. Three boys, same haircut, same red jackets, arms around each other, smiling, and behind them, unmistakably, this very house. That's when I got chills. Not from the box, from the way the light in the attic flickered again as I stared at the photo. Fun fact: break Polaroid film degrades differently depending on humidity. In dry environments like Texas, old photos yellow, but keep their details longer. This one had held on. Now here's a thought orchestra academics love to debate. Is memory a reconstruction or a recording? Because in that moment, the photo didn't just show me the past. It felt like it was pulling me into it. And here's your first bit of aging wisdom tonight. If you're old enough to remember riding your bike without a phone or a helmet, you're old enough to know what silence means in a story like this. I didn't sleep that night, not even badly, just not at all. I left the box in the garage, locked the door, and went back inside, but my brain kept spinning like a ceiling fan with a broken blade. It wobbled between, this is a prank, and you just found the beginning of a horror novel. By sunrise, I had made coffee strong enough to put hair on a baby's chest and stood on my porch staring at 214 like it owed me an explanation. I held the photo in my hand. The boys' red jackets seemed almost too clean for how faded the rest of the image looked. I decided to do the least responsible thing possible. I knocked on the door of the only person on this street who might know anything, Elaine Cooper. She still lived across the road, had for 40 years. A woman with a posture like her spine was forged from moral obligation. She answered my knock with a pair of gardening gloves and a stare that felt like it was measuring my soul for weight and content. "I found this," I said, offering the photo. She took one look and didn't breathe for a full 3 seconds. Then her fingers clamped down like pincers on the edges. "Where did you get this?" "Your neighbor's garage." Her face didn't move, but something behind her eyes flickered, the kind of flicker you only see when someone's heart restarts after years of staying quiet. She didn't invite me in. She didn't need to. We both just turned like choreographed dancers and stared across the street at the Cooper house. "That's Daniel in the middle," she said quietly. He always insisted on standing between his brothers. We watched as a crow hopped along the porch railing and then flew off. Elaine whispered, "I thought I buried them years ago. Thought I had to." You want to hear something weird? But older people, they carry trauma like it's part of their body, like a scar they stop noticing because it's been there since they were young. But it's still there, still itches in the rain. She turned to me again, still gripping the photo. "Do the police know?" "Not yet." Her nod was so small it barely qualified. "Tell them. But don't let them throw this away again." She went back inside without another word. So I made the call, and within hours, Broken Elm Street had its first police cruisers in over 2 decades. Side tangent, mildly hilarious. One of the responding officers asked me if I used TikTok or whatever to discover this, because that's how kids do true crime now. I told him I used a crowbar and insomnia. He didn't laugh. Detective Kwan showed up mid-afternoon. She wore an ill-fitting blazer and a look that said she'd rather be anywhere else. She cataloged everything: the photo, the yo-yos, the box, the card. She did it with the precision of someone who's been told to reopen a file they'd hoped was never coming back. "This case has been cold since '94, she said, sealing a plastic evidence bag. "There's no active leads, but we'll log it." Elaine came over later. She didn't say much, just sat on the front steps with me holding the Polaroid like it might dissolve if she loosened her grip. "He bought those jackets," she murmured. "Said red was a superhero color. Said they'd be safer if people could see them better." I didn't know what to say. But here's the academic phrase of the night: closure is a myth manufactured by storytellers, not psychologists. Real grief, it just changes flavor. Elaine stood, eventually pocketed the photo, and went home. She didn't thank me. I think she didn't know how, and I didn't blame her. That night I returned to the garage. I stared at the space where the box had been. There was a faint smudge on the wood. A name, Evan, carved in shaky block letters. Suddenly the air didn't feel like heat anymore. It felt like pressure. I backed out slowly, locked the door behind me, and I swear as I turned the key I heard it again: soft, high-pitched laughter. Not echoing, just passing through, like memory. Quirky fact for the road: some people believe laughter from children in old houses is just a house settling in thermal contraction. Me, I believe in insulation and ghosts, usually in that order. Tonight's aging wisdom. You know you've lived long enough when mystery stops meaning fun and starts meaning something everyone else decided to ignore. The next morning I sat at the kitchen table staring at the crust of my burnt toast while the photo of the boys lay between my coffee mug and a stack of unopened mail. Daniel, Evan, and Miles had committed their names to memory now. It felt wrong not to. I'd planned to go to work that day, I really had. But my car keys sat in the bowl by the door untouched. Instead, I opened my laptop and searched Triplets Missing, 1989, Broken Elm Street, Texas. The first result hit like a punch to the gut. A grainy scan of a newspaper article: Rosewood County Weekly, August 1989. Local triplets vanish without a trace. Daniel, Evan, and Miles Cooper, age 7, last seen riding bikes near their home. No leads, no suspects. There were more clippings, photos. Each boy had a distinct feature, but they were undeniably identical. One had a chipped tooth, another a mole on his left cheek. And in every image they looked like they were having the best day of their lives. Elaine was quoted in a follow-up piece from 1990. "They didn't just disappear. Someone made them disappear." That sentence stuck with me. It had teeth. I closed the laptop, stepped outside. The air felt heavier today, like the street had learned I was looking. Detective Kwan had said they'd follow up if anything new comes up. That's a phrase that means we're already forgetting. So I followed up myself. There was something weird about the garage, not just the crate, but the floor. Slight slope, small crack near the back corner, almost like the foundation had shifted unevenly. You ever see concrete sweat? It shouldn't, but it was. Right there in the crack, a thin line of moisture in the shape of an L. I borrowed a moisture meter from the local hardware store. The clerk didn't ask why. I think he knew. It pinged higher than it should have. Something was off underneath. So I called in a favor from a friend who worked with ground-penetrating radar. And because I'm charming or possibly cursed, he said sure. When the radar truck arrived 2 days later, Elaine came out to watch. She brought lemonade like this was a backyard barbecue. I asked if she wanted to go inside while they scanned. No, she said quietly but firmly. If they're down there, they have waited long enough for me to stand with them. The scan took an hour. The technician frowned the way dentists do before they tell you the tooth is coming out. There's something under the slab, he said, tapping the screen. Roughly 5 feet long, 3 feet wide. Not standard plumbing. Definitely not structural. What is it then, I asked. He shrugged. Could be a sealed pit. Could be a crawl space someone forgot to map. Could be, I don't know, but it doesn't belong. Elaine's face didn't change. She just whispered, I knew it. Aging wisdom time. Eventually your intuition stops needing permission from your logic. That's how you know you've lived. We called it in. Again, Detective Kwan returned. This time she didn't bother with a blazer. Just jeans, gloves, and a clipboard. She authorized the dig, said it was routine due diligence. Sure, just like exhuming a 35-year-old crime scene was routine. The excavator arrived the next morning. The neighbors came out to watch from behind curtains and hedges. Everyone suddenly remembered they lived on a street with a past. At 4:17 p.m., the operator shut off the engine and waved someone over. I was already walking toward the crater when Elaine grabbed my arm. Her grip was iron. Tell me, she said. They found bikes, 3 of them. Red, rusted, still locked together with the same tangled chain from the newspaper photos. That's when I realized something cold and cruel. Someone had buried the evidence, but not far enough. They wanted it forgotten, not gone. Publicly debatable academic phrase. Forensic silence is not absence, it's engineered doubt. That's what one criminal psych professor once claimed. And now I believe her. Fun fact, rusted bike chains under the right conditions can outlast wood and certain plastics. They become anchors. Elaine stood at the edge of the dig site as they laid the bikes out on a tarp. Her hand covered her mouth. Her shoulders shook, but she didn't cry. Those are theirs, she whispered. They used to race in the cul-de-sac every Saturday. I looked around at the neighbors. Not a single one stepped forward. Not a single one said, I remember. That's the part that chilled me. Quirky side note. There's a theory that neighborhoods can develop collective amnesia, a defense mechanism for communities with unprocessed trauma. I'm starting to think Broken Elm Street had mastered it. Elaine didn't look away from the bikes for a long time, and I realized something else. This wasn't over. Not even close. Elaine didn't say a word for the rest of that day. Not when the bikes were bagged and tagged, not when the officers filled their SUVs with tarp-wrapped silence, not even when Detective Kwan handed her a thin card and said, we'll be in touch. She just stood there, hands folded, mouth tight, eyes fixed on the dirt like it might cough up something else if she stared long enough. I walked her home. She didn't ask me to, but she didn't say no either. That's how grief works. When it's been sitting too long, it forgets how to speak, but it remembers how to lean. Her living room smelled like tea and old wood polish, the kind of scent you only get in houses where no one's moved the furniture in 20 years. She placed the Polaroid of the boys on the mantel just beside a faded graduation photo and a ceramic frog that looked like it hadn't smiled in decades. I stopped planting roses the year they disappeared, she said suddenly. They used to help me water them after school. She looked down at her dirt-lined fingernails and gave a dry chuckle. Now it's just weeds and lilies too stubborn to die. We sat for a while in that stillness. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was patient, like the room had spent years waiting for someone to talk about the triplets again. Then she asked, do you think they suffered? And I didn't lie. I don't know. That was the first time she cried. Here's your aging wisdom moment. When people say time heals, they forget to mention that it only heals what we let it touch. The next day, Elaine called me. No greeting, just, I think I know who boarded up that garage. My pulse jumped. There was a man, she said, lived 2 blocks down, Vernon Hale, retired hospice nurse, kind eyes, loved his garden, came to help after the boys left. She paused. He had a key to our house, back when we still hoped they were coming home. I looked up the name, and what do you know, Vernon Hale died in 2003. Stroke. No children. No surviving relatives. But get this, his house was purchased 6 months later by a trust with no listed beneficiary. The new owners never moved in. It just sat, untouched. That's when I knew this went deeper than a cold case. So I drove to Vernon's old address. The lawn was mostly dust. The shutters hung sideways, but the garage sealed tight. No handle, no keyhole, just screws. Hundreds of them. I felt a familiar itch in my fingertips, the one that means you're about to find something that doesn't want to be found. But I didn't have a crowbar this time. So I left, and I started making calls. Hospice agency, property records, county archives. Most of it was dead ends, literally. But then came a name. A temporary caretaker listed on Vernon's file, Ralph Mason. No license. No forwarding address. Just a P.O. box. Here's the quirky fact of the day: more than 12,000 active P.O. boxes in Texas are linked to people who don't technically exist, ghost identities, used for everything from mail fraud to, well, this. I tracked the box to a closed branch office in Rosewood. Nothing left but dust and a ceiling fan that spun like it was trying to remember something. But that wasn't the end. I kept going. I found Vernon's obituary in a small paper. Buried deep was this line: preceded in death by wife June Hale and their son Matthew, age 3. Wait, what son? The Cooper boys never had a playmate named Matthew. No one in the neighborhood remembered a child in Vernon's house. No toys in the yard. No tricycle in the driveway. But the birth record said Matthew Hale, born 1957, died 1960, cause of death, accidental drowning, or so it claimed. Now here's where it gets weird, and I mean capital W weird. That death certificate. It was filed 6 months late, and the corner of the scan had a handwritten note: discrepancy flagged. No follow-up. Academically speaking, this is what's known as a recording gap, a fancy way of saying someone slipped through the cracks and nobody cared enough to fix it. And that brings us to today's very real, very unsettling theory. People who lose a child too young sometimes try to get that child back in other ways. I called Elaine. There was a son, I told her. Before the triplets. Before any of this. She was silent on the other end. Then in a voice so thin I could barely hear it, I think we need to dig again. Tonight's closing fact: 93% of cold cases in the U.S. remain unsolved. Not because the truth is missing, but because it's boxed, buried, and bolted behind drywall. Elaine didn't hesitate. The next morning, she showed up at my front door in jeans and work gloves, her graying hair tied back like she meant business. In one hand, she held a garden spade. In the other, a folded copy of Vernon Hale's obituary with the name Matthew underlined 3 times. We start at his old house, she said. I didn't argue. I grabbed a flashlight, a crowbar, and a bottle of water, and we drove in silence. Vernon's place was as lifeless as ever. The porch sagged. Weeds cracked through the concrete like they were trying to break free. A faded wind chime clinked lazily as we walked by. We didn't go through the front door. We headed straight for the garage. That wall, the one screwed shut from the outside. Dozens of flathead screws, like someone wanted to make sure no one, not even time, could peel it open. Elaine stood back while I worked. First screw came out like butter. Second fought me. Third snapped and made me say a PG-13 word I immediately apologized for. Finally, after an hour and several knuckle scrapes, the panel groaned and gave way. Behind it, more drywall. Oh, come on, I muttered. Vernon, you paranoid hoarder. But this drywall felt different, newer. Clean lines, no cobwebs, no dust. Elaine reached out, pressed a hand flat against it. It's hollow, she whispered. We looked at each other. Then I did what any rational adult would do when faced with the possibility of a horrifying secret wall cavity. I punched it. Okay, I tapped it with the crowbar, but it made the sound I feared most, the dull thunk of space behind. I pulled, and this time the wall didn't fight. It peeled open like a wound. Behind it was a narrow space, barely 3 feet deep. Concrete floor, no shelves, no light, just a wooden crate, smaller than the one in Elaine's garage. Older too, the wood grayed and soft, the hinges barely clinging on. It wasn't locked, just sealed shut with 4 nails. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. That's not a storage box. She was right. It was a time capsule of something someone wanted buried. I pried the lid. Dust puffed out like ash. The air went still. Inside, a child's shoe. A drawing stick figures 3 of them standing beside a large square object with wheels. A dime, 1 tree, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope. Elaine reached in slowly, hand shaking. She opened it, a single Polaroid. 3 boys again, matching red jackets, smiling. But this one, Shoy, this one was different. They were older, maybe 9, maybe 10, and behind them was a building, a barn, and a red Cadillac. Where is this? I asked. Elaine didn't answer right away. She just stared at the car in the photo. Then softly, that's Vernon's barn in Rosewood County. She remembered it from a 4th of July picnic. The Hales had hosted a few families one summer. The barn had horses back then, red paint, white trim, and the Cadillac, Vernon's pride and joy, parked beside it like a guard dog. But here's the kicker: that barn still stood, still listed as part of the estate, still sealed tight, and no one had searched it. Today's quirky side note: red cars are statistically more likely to be stolen than any other color. But Vernon's Cadillac, it stayed right where it was, untouched, hidden. I called Detective Kwan. This time she didn't sound bored. We arranged to meet at the barn. She'd bring a team, forensics, and a warrant. Elaine and I beat them there. We walked the perimeter, dust and bees and heat like a thick curtain around us. The barn door creaked open with a push. Inside, darkness, cool, the smell of hay and rust and something sweeter like old fruit gone bad. We turned on our flashlights. What we stopped us both. 3 sleeping bags, 3 plastic bowls, a coloring book open to a page of 3 smiling kids holding hands. Elaine whispered, they were here. And that's when I noticed the initials on the wall, E plus D plus M, scratched faintly into the wood. Evan, Daniel, Miles. They weren't just taken, they were kept. Aging insight time. At some point, your gut stops being metaphorical. It actually starts sensing things. And right then, mine felt sick. Detective Kwan arrived 15 minutes later. She saw the bags, the bowls, the photo, and she didn't wait this time. She called in a team. By sundown, the whole barn was cordoned off. They were digging again. And me, I stood next to Elaine, staring at that Cadillac in the corner. Still clean, still locked, like it had been waiting. Like everything in this story had been waiting. Academic theory of the night. Prolonged captivity alters the memory architecture of childhood survivors, especially in identity-related recall. That'll matter later. But for now, all we knew was this. Someone had raised the boys, somewhere, somehow. And maybe, just maybe, they were still alive. The Cadillac's paint was almost too perfect. You could see your reflection in it if you wanted to, though neither Elaine nor I did. The barn was oddly pristine. Dusty, sure, but not decayed. Not forgotten. That's what made it so eerie. Someone had been maintaining it. Not regularly, but just enough to keep it from falling apart. Like a shrine or a prison. Detective Kwan and her team started sweeping the place for hidden compartments. They tapped floorboards, checked under loose hay, even brought in a portable GPR unit. Me, I stayed near the car. Something about it called to me. Maybe it was the way the light hit the windshield just right, like a stage spotlight. Or maybe it was instinct. You develop that, I think, after you stare into enough dark rooms, hoping not to find anything, and then you do. Elaine leaned in beside me. He always cleaned that thing with a toothbrush, she said, her voice almost a laugh. Said it was the only part of his life that made sense. That alone was the kind of sentence you file away and let haunt you later. Kwan approached. We've got something behind the rear wall. Looks like a storage loft was closed off. Elaine and I followed as the team climbed the rickety ladder. The loft was cramped, barely enough room to stand upright. But on the far side, tucked beneath a tarp, they found another box, smaller than the others. Inside, not evidence, not toys, just documents. Folders labeled with dates, photocopies of birth certificates. Daniel Cooper, Evan Cooper, Miles Cooper. Then three more names: Gabriel Moss, Jonah Wren, Nico Fielding. Elaine's breath caught. These aren't aliases, she said. These are replacements. Each folder contained a new identity forged: schools, vaccinations, even sketches of handwriting practice. Like someone had built them new lives from scratch. But why, I asked aloud, more to the air than to anyone. Detective Kwan answered anyway. This isn't abduction, it's reprogramming. Tonight's academic gem. In long-term, unsanctioned custody, captors often rename their victims to maintain psychological control, a process akin to forced rebirth. And there it was, the twisted logic of it all. Vernon hadn't just kept the boys. He tried to replace their identities. Elaine clutched one of the folders to her chest like it might bleed. This is what they became. We found a small cassette tape player in the corner, dusty but intact. Beside it, a single labeled tape, July 1990 progress. Quan hesitated, then pressed play. A man's voice crackled through the static. Calm, controlled. Daniel has begun responding to the name Jonah. He still hesitates before answering, but progress is visible. Evan, Gabriel, remains resistant. Miles now, Nico is quiet, but they no longer ask for home. Elaine turned away. I don't blame her. I nearly threw up. Here's your aging wisdom dose. When you're young, you think evil comes with red eyes and a pitchfork. When you're older, you realize it usually just sounds like a clipboard and a calm tone. Later that night, we sat on the motel balcony. Elaine held a folder in her lap, one labeled Gabriel Moss. It had a photo, blurry, recent, a teenager, maybe 17. Curly dark hair, thin frame, big eyes. He looks like Evan, she whispered. That's when I told her what I'd found earlier, a nonprofit website registered under Vernon's name. Still active, still quietly operating in a rural corner of Arizona. They claimed to rescue abandoned youth, offered alternative identities for traumatized children in need of rebirth. No donation page, no staff listing, just an address, and one photo on the homepage, a greenhouse filled with boys all facing away from the camera. Elaine stared at it on my phone for a long time. Then she said, "We're going." I didn't argue, because honestly I was already packed. Quirky fact: for the road, greenhouses are often used in cult rehabilitation spaces for their therapeutic light exposure. Or, as one psychologist once said, sunlight makes it easier to lie. The next morning we drove 15 hours straight, through dust storms, past gas stations that sold alien jerky, and into a valley where the sun felt closer than it had any right to be. When we pulled up to the address listed on the website, Elaine gripped the dashboard like it might run away without her. It wasn't a cult compound, it wasn't a school, it was a mission garden. Clean, quiet, suspiciously untouched by time. We stepped inside. A woman greeted us with a soft voice and a clipboard, short white hair, straw sun hat. She introduced herself as Sister Mara. "Are you here for a tour?" she asked. Elaine didn't blink. "We're here to speak with Mr. Fielding." The woman hesitated, just enough to confirm everything. "I believe he was in the greenhouse earlier," she said slowly, "but he may have returned to his residence." Detective Kwan, who had arrived shortly after us, showed her badge. "We're reopening a missing persons case," she said. "We believe this property is involved." Mara's smile vanished. "I'll find him." And as she disappeared down a hallway, the air around us seemed to hold its breath. We were close, so close it hurt. The silence in the greenhouse wasn't peaceful. It was practiced. Every leaf seemed posed. Every tool was neatly aligned. Every pot arranged just so, like the plants had been trained to behave. The heat inside was thick, not just from the sun filtering through glass, but from the anticipation pressing on my lungs. Then we heard it. Footsteps on the gravel path outside. He entered like a breeze, slipping through a crack in the door. Tall, wiry, with salt white hair and a face that carried more kindness than guilt. But guilt never walks in with a sign around its neck. Elaine's voice was barely more than a breath. "Howard." He turned, paused, blinked, and then smiled. Elaine, like he was greeting an old neighbor. She didn't move. "Where are they?" Howard looked at Detective Kwan's badge before answering. "You'll want to speak in my office." His office was a converted shed. Inside it smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and something metallic. On the wall hung a calendar from 1998. Beneath it, a metal file cabinet locked. He sat, folded his hands. "You're here about the boys." Not a question. Elaine stayed standing. "My sons. My triplets." Howard nodded. "I cared for them. I didn't take them. That was Vernon. But I kept them safe." He opened the cabinet, slowly removed a folder. Inside were photographs: Daniel, Evan, and another boy I didn't recognize at first, Gabriel. The boys were older in the photos. 10, maybe 11, always facing away from the camera, always near that red Cadillac or the barn. Elaine's hands trembled as she touched the images. "I was told you were in jail," she whispered. "Or dead." Howard looked genuinely confused. "They were told you gave them up." Detective Kwan broke in. "Where are they now?" Howard hesitated. "I only know where one still lives. The others left years ago." And then came the most surreal sentence I'd ever heard. "Daniel works in the kitchen." We stared. "I'll get him," Howard said, and before we could stop him, he stepped out. Aging wisdom pause. When you get old, you realize the worst shocks don't come with music stings or screams. They come with someone saying he's in the kitchen. Like it's normal. Elaine looked like the air had drained from her. I helped her sit down. Then footsteps again. He entered slowly, wiping his hands on a towel. Mid-20s, tall, tightly curled hair, warm brown skin. He looked exactly like the boy in the Polaroid, but grown. The jawline, the posture, even the way he held the towel in his right hand, like he used to do with his action figures. Elaine stood. He froze. "Mom," he whispered, and the word landed like thunder in the shed. Elaine moved toward him, her face breaking into pieces. "Danny," he flinched. I was told you died." Howard, standing in the doorway, looked away. "I thought you were in prison," Daniel said, barely louder than breath. "That you'd abandoned us." Elaine didn't correct him. She just reached out, hands shaking. And Daniel stepped into her arms like a child who'd been holding in tears for 20 years. They stood there, still, until the silence became sacred. Quirky fact time. The human brain processes familiar faces faster than any other visual stimulus, even after decades. That's why when you see someone you know after 20 years, it only takes a fraction of a second for your gut to scream, "That's them." Eventually, they sat down. Elaine asked the questions no one ever wants to ask. "How long were you here?" "Since I was 9. "Do you remember your brothers?" Daniel nodded. "Evan and Miles, but they don't use those names now." "Where are they?" "I don't know. They left. I stayed. I didn't know what else to do." He looked to Howard. He said the world wouldn't understand, that people like us don't belong out there. Detective Kwan's jaw tightened. "You're free now," she said quietly. But Daniel didn't move. "I don't know what that means." Elaine reached into her bag, pulled out a photograph. The one from the garage, the boys in red jackets. "You used to say red made you invincible," she said. Daniel laughed. "Quiet but real. Still my favorite color." Elaine held his hand. "We'll find them, all of you." Publicly debated academic phrase of the night: reunion trauma can trigger cognitive dissonance in long-lost children, leading to self-fracturing behaviors and identity crises. Daniel didn't need to read that in a journal. He was that phrase. He agreed to a DNA test. Detective Kwan made the call. Results would take 72 hours. In the meantime, we stayed. Daniel gave us names, descriptions, places they'd mentioned. Evan had gone to New Mexico. Gabriel Miles was last seen in Nevada. We took notes. We cried. A little. Then Elaine turned to Howard. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" And he said without a hint of irony, "I thought I was helping." Helping. That word. That delusion. Final thought for tonight. Sometimes the greatest villains don't laugh maniacally or twirl mustaches. They make tea. They prune roses. They think they're helping. The next morning was quieter. We sat at the motel diner, one of those places with sticky menus, ceramic mugs, and a waitress who refills your coffee before you realize you need more. Daniel stirred his oatmeal like he was waiting for it to say something. Elaine watched him with the aching intensity of a mother trying to memorize every blink, every breath. Detective Kwan had stayed up most of the night making calls. Her notepad now looked like a web spun in red ink and caffeine. "New Mexico," Daniel repeated. "That's where Evan said he was going. He wanted distance." He poked at a raisin, said he couldn't sleep near flowers anymore. Elaine gently asked, Do you remember why? Daniel nodded. Vernon used to put lilies by the door when one of us had done something wrong. It meant punishment was coming. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. Here's your aging wisdom check-in. Some stories don't need details. You learn to read between silences, and that's where the real chapters are written. Quan tapped her pen, and Miles Daniel hesitated. He called himself Gabriel. He always liked that name. He gave a small smile, said it sounded like someone who had wings. Where is he now? Daniel's expression darkened. I don't know. He left without saying goodbye. Took the red notebook, the one with the drawings. Elaine blinked. The same one from the garage. Yeah, he used to sketch the three of us, always with a row, sometimes with a boat. Said one day we'd sail away. Quirky fact, according to child psychology, drawing boats is common in kids with trauma. It's symbolic boats carry you somewhere new, somewhere safer, or maybe just away. We left the diner and drove to the address Daniel remembered, a small storage facility near the edge of town. He hadn't been back in years, but something told him we needed to look. Inside a rusted unit behind a pile of tarps and paint cans, we found it. A box, not wood this time, plastic sealed tight with duct tape. We opened it slowly. Inside, a red spiral notebook. 3 toy army men, a photo of 3 boys fishing, a ticket stub to a drive-in theater 1997, and a letter, folded neatly addressed in blocky handwriting, to my brothers. Elaine's hands trembled. She passed the letter to Daniel. He read it aloud, voice steady but low. If you're reading this, it means you found the trail. I'm okay, or trying to be. I remember everything, even the things they told me to forget. Daniel, you always protected us. Evan, you always asked the hard questions. I was the quiet one. I listened, I watched, and I knew. I knew we were taken. I knew it wasn't our fault, but I also knew we couldn't stay there forever. I had to leave. I'm not sure who I am yet, but I know who I'm not. I'm not Nico. I'm not a project. I'm your brother. And if you ever find me, I'll be waiting by the river we drew. Silence, then Daniel whispered. He remembered the river. Elaine sat on the ground, tears slipping silently down her face. You boys used to draw a river on everything, she said. Menus, envelopes, even the walls. She gave a watery laugh. I had to repaint the kitchen 3 times. Quan crouched beside the box. This ticket stub, the drive-in, it's in Nevada. That's a starting point. So we went. Just like that. We packed up, left behind the motel's buzzing neon sign and the smell of stale carpet. Daniel came with us. Elaine wouldn't let him out of her sight. That drive felt different. Less haunting, more raw. Hope has weight too. It sits in your chest like a book you were afraid to open. We arrived in Nevada 3 days later. The drive-in was still there barely, a skeleton of its former self. Screen torn, concession stands shuttered, but the trees still standing, and the river not far behind it just as they'd drawn. We searched. For hours, no Gabriel, no sign of a camp, just the wind and the occasional whisper of water over stones. But then Daniel found it, carved into the bark of a willow tree, M plus D plus E. Still here. Elaine reached out, traced the letters with her fingertips, and then a whistle. Soft, low, familiar. Daniel turned toward it like it was coded into his bones. A figure stepped from the tree line. Taller now, broader, hair longer, eyes darker. And he smiled. Not a full smile, just enough to shake the world. Hey, he said. Daniel choked. Gabriel. The boy nodded. Still hate that name. Elaine didn't move. Not yet. Gabriel looked at her. Are you her? Elaine nodded. Gabriel took 1 step forward, then another, and then the dam broke. Elaine wrapped her arms around him like she could stitch time back together with her embrace. He didn't pull away. And for the first time in 35 years, all 3 boys stood together under a sky that hadn't forgotten them. Publicly debatable phrase for the night, healing isn't reunion, it's recognition. They recognized each other, and that was the beginning of everything. The motel we checked into that night had 1 working lamp and a view of the parking lot's single palm tree, but none of that mattered. Because inside room 12, 3 boys who hadn't stood in the same place since 1980 now sat cross-legged on a sagging bedspread, passing around a bag of vending machine pretzels like it was a feast. Elaine sat in the armchair quiet, watching, memorizing. Daniel told Gabrielle no Miles about the greenhouse, about the photo albums, about the day Elaine walked into the barn and said his name. Gabriel listened, not wide-eyed, not crying, just steady, like he'd known it would happen one day, and now that it had, he wasn't sure how to hold it. "I thought you were dead," he said finally. Elaine nodded. "I thought you were too." "I tried not to forget your voice," he said, but it started to fade. "I was afraid it meant I didn't love you anymore." Elaine's voice cracked. "No, it just means someone tried too hard to erase you." Daniel reached out and squeezed his brother's arm. "You still bite your thumbnail, just like always." Gabriel blinked and looked down. "Guess some things don't go away." Aging wisdom moment. Healing isn't some grand ceremony. Sometimes it's just sitting in a room where the people who love you stayed. Later, after the boys had fallen into a heap of exhausted limbs and unspoken memories, Elaine and I sat on the motel steps with cups of weak coffee. "They don't remember everything," she said softly. "They don't need to," I replied. She looked out at the quiet street. "But what about who they became?" And that's the question, isn't it? Because if someone rewrites your story page by page and tells you you're someone else, when you finally get the old pages back, what do you do with them? Academic phrase of the day: identity is a dynamic construct influenced by memory, social context, and narrative continuity, which is a fancy way of saying it's messy. 3 boys disappeared. 3 young men returned, but they weren't the same ones frozen in that 1989 Polaroid. They were layered now, with scars and years in silence. And maybe that was okay. The DNA test came back the next morning. All 3 matched, a 99% confirmation. Elaine didn't need the paper, but she framed it anyway, just in case anyone ever doubts again, she said. Then came the hard part: the world. Re-entry, news crews, reporters, psychologists, skeptics. Miles or Gabriel, depending on the hour, handled it by deflecting questions with sarcasm and avoiding mirrors. Evan, quiet, thoughtful, still, jumpy at loud sounds, chose silence. Daniel did the talking, not because he liked it, but because he was the only one who could do it without looking down. They gave statements, carefully worded, no accusations, no lawsuits yet. Elaine didn't want justice through courts. Not yet. She wanted reunion, restoration. "I want them to breathe without flinching," she told me. Here's a quirky fact: trauma survivors often develop hypervigilance, a state where your body's always ready for disaster even during sleep. You learn to listen for silence because sometimes that's when the worst happens. But something started to shift. Daniel found a job in a bakery, early mornings, repetitive tasks, the comforting smell of dough. Evan started painting abstract pieces in red and gray. Miles disappeared for a week. We thought we'd lost him again. But then he came back, with a box, inside the red notebook. The drawings were still there. Stick figures with capes, a river, a boat, a house with too many windows. He handed it to Elaine without a word. She didn't cry. She just opened to the last page. 3 boys, facing the camera, smiling. But this time the lines were fresh, new ink. Elaine showed it to me that night. He remembered, she said, not just the trauma, but the hope. That's the part people forget, that survivors aren't just haunted by what happened. They're defined by what they hoped might still happen someday. Publicly debated phrase for tonight: hope is retroactive. You believe it most once it arrives. We held a small ceremony in the backyard of Elaine's home. No press, no guests, just them. She planted 3 rose bushes, 1 for each son. Red, their superhero color. Daniel placed the original Polaroid in a small frame beside the garden. Evan tied a string of bells in the elm tree so the wind can talk to us. Miles carved a single word into the base of the fence. Still, Elaine asked, "Still what?" He shrugged. "Still here. Still us. Still becoming." Later that night, I watched them from the porch. Daniel asleep on the swing, Evan painting the tree bark, Miles humming a song no one else seemed to know. And I thought, they didn't just survive. They reassembled. From fragments and lies and silence, they made a shape again. Not the same shape, but something strong, something alive. By the end of the month, the headlines had faded. No more camera crews parked outside Elaine's house. No more news anchors calling it a miraculous reunion while mispronouncing all their names. The world moved on the way it always does to the next strange headline, the next broken story. But for the Cooper family, life had just begun again. Daniel kept working early mornings at the bakery. It suited him: routine warm ovens, quiet hums of cinnamon and flour. Evan started taking night classes in art therapy. His drawings got less abstract, more detailed. Real things: a porch, a garage, 3 bikes. Miles Ever the Wanderer got a part-time job at a small animal shelter outside town. Said it was better to care for things that bite less than people. The cats adored him. They didn't live under the same roof. That would have been too much. Elaine bought a duplex and gave them space. But dinner was always at her place. Tuesdays and Fridays, no matter what. The first few were awkward: 3 grown men sitting at a table that used to serve them SpaghettiOs and sippy cups. But slowly, forks replaced silence. Stories replaced gaps. Laughter crept back in. The good kind, unpracticed, real. Aging wisdom time. The most healing thing you can do for someone isn't giving advice or fixing them. It's setting a table and saying, "There's a seat here for you no matter what." One night, after too much roast chicken and not enough mashed potatoes, Elaine handed each of them a box. Inside, the keepsakes that had survived: photos, baby teeth report cards, even an old Walkman. Daniel pulled out a cassette labeled Car Mix. Summer '88. He smiled. Dad's terrible road trip music. Evan snorted. Chicago on repeat. Miles held up a tiny red shoe. "This used to fit," Elaine nodded. "You hated socks." They spent that evening on the floor, surrounded by memories. Miles fell asleep with the shoebox still on his chest. Evan curled under an Afghan. Daniel sat on the porch watching the wind, and I sat with Elaine. She said, "They're still broken. You know that, right?" I nodded. "They'll probably always be broken," she added. "But now they're here, and I can hold them when the world shakes again." Here's your quirky fact of the night. The Japanese art of kintsugi involves repairing broken pottery with gold, making the fractures part of the design. The idea isn't to hide the damage, it's to make it beautiful. That's what the Cooper boys were now, kintsugi people. Days passed, then weeks. And one day Evan came into the kitchen with a notebook and asked Elaine, "Would you come with me to the police station?" She raised an eyebrow. "Why, I want to give a statement," he said. "All of it." We drove him there. The officer was kind, patient. Evan talked for 3 hours. About the greenhouse, about the punishments, about Vernon, about Fielding. When he finished, he handed over the red notebook. "This," he said, "is what they tried to erase." The investigation reopened. Fielding, who had cooperated earlier, was now a key witness. Charges were filed. Slowly, carefully, but they were filed. And then something unexpected. A letter. Addressed to Elaine. Return address: Arizona State Correctional Facility. Ralph Mason. She opened it at the table, hand steady. Inside, a single page. "Mrs. Cooper, watched your boys grow up in ways I should not have. I believed I was saving them from something worse. I know now I was part of the thing they needed saving from. I do not ask forgiveness, only that you continue to give them what I never could: a name, a mother, a life." Or Mason. Elaine folded the letter. "He's right about one thing." I looked up. "Which part?" "That I'm their mother. Still, always." Publicly debatable phrase for this part. Forgiveness without justice is a form of complicity. But Elaine, she never used the word forgive. She just used forward. That fall, Daniel enrolled in culinary school. Evan opened a small studio that offered free art classes for kids. Miles, still not fully sure what he wanted, started volunteering at a youth shelter in town. They all wore red on their birthdays. Not planned, just instinct. And one day I passed by Elaine's garden and saw something new. A 4th rose bush. Not red, but gold. I asked her why. She said, "That one's for who they could have been and who they're still becoming." The season shifted, though you wouldn't know it from the Texas heat. Fall came in name: only a slight breeze instead of a furnace blast. But for the Cooper family, it brought something: real rhythm. Tuesday dinners, Friday art nights, Sunday morning drives, sometimes just for donuts and silence. They weren't trying to go back. There was no before anymore. Only after. Only now. One day, Daniel invited me to the bakery. He wore a white apron, flour on his cheek, and a grin that reminded me of the 7-year-old in the Polaroid, just taller, stronger, and with more quiet behind his eyes. "I want to show you something," he said, leading me to the back. On a high shelf nestled among baking trays and bulk cinnamon was a box. Inside, 3 toy figurines, the ones from the crate. "I keep them here," he said, to remind me what got buried. Then he lifted out a small wooden plaque he'd carved himself. It read, "We came back anyway, aging wisdom moment. You don't grow out of pain, you grow around it, like tree rings around a lightning strike." That night, we celebrated Elaine's birthday. Nothing fancy, just barbecue and string lights and a cake that was somehow both lopsided and perfect. Daniel baked it, Evan decorated it with red frosting. Miles spelled "Happy Birthday" missing the D and refused to fix it. "I think it's funnier that way," he said. Elaine made a toast. She raised her glass of sweet tea, cleared her throat, and said, "To what we found, and to what didn't break." Simple, strong. The boys clinked their glasses. Evan smiled sideways. Daniel nodded. Miles chugged his and asked if dessert came with candles or just carbs. Here's a quirky fact. In some parts of Scandinavia, people celebrate birthdays with silent morning parades. Family wakes up early, brings breakfast to your bed, and sings. No gifts, just presents. That's what this night felt like. A silent parade of presents. Later, we sat by the fire pit. Daniel stared into the flames. "Do you think we were the only ones?" The question lingered. Heavy. Miles spoke next. "I used to think we were. That we were broken in a way no one else understood." But Evan prompted. Miles looked up. "Then I met a kid at the shelter. Said he didn't remember his mom's face, but he remembered her voice." He swallowed. "I gave him the red notebook." Elaine blinked. "Your notebook," Miles nodded. "Told him he could draw his way out." Nobody spoke after that. We just watched the fire settle into embers. Publicly debated academic phrase of the night: transferred resilience can replicate familial structures in non-biological communities. In plain terms, healing spreads. Evan later told me he wanted to start a program for kids who'd aged out of foster care, for those whose stories never got found. "I'm not the kid in that picture anymore," he said, "but I can be the reason someone else doesn't disappear." That kind of bravery doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from remembering and choosing to stay visible anyway. A week later, something strange happened. Elaine got a phone call. She listened. Her eyes went wide. Her hand shook. She hung up and sat down without saying a word. I asked, "What happened?" She looked at me stunned. "They found a box in Louisiana. Same crate style, same handwriting. A sheriff had opened a long sealed wall cavity during a foreclosure inspection. Inside, toys, clothes, a photograph of 3 girls, identical twins, and a third child. No labels, no names, and a note. One line. They belonged to someone. We shared the story with the boys. Miles was the first to speak. We weren't the only ones, and that changed everything. Aging wisdom for this part. Once you know something dark exists, you can either flinch or bring a flashlight. Daniel called the bakery, took a leave of absence. Evan paused his art classes. Miles, who had finally learned to keep a suitcase packed, was already by the car. Elaine didn't argue. She handed them snacks and maps and told them to be careful. "Don't just find the lost," she said. "Remind them they're worth finding." That night before they left, I walked out to the rose bushes. The 4th one, the gold one, was blooming again, its petals wide and stubborn in the moonlight. Elaine joined me. "They were never really gone," she said, "just hidden." I asked, "Are you scared for them?" She nodded. "Of course, but I'm more afraid of what happens if they don't go." I looked back at the house, lights in the windows, drawings on the fridge, shoes on the porch, 3 pairs slightly muddy exactly where they belonged. And I realized something, and the story wasn't ending, it was expanding. Louisiana was not what they expected. Hotter than Texas somehow. Wetter too, the kind of damp that made your shirt stick to your back before you even finished your first sentence. But it wasn't the weather that made the trip feel heavier. It was the box. Identical construction. Same dimensions, same age. Inside, a pair of small ballet slippers, 3 plastic bracelets, a folded piece of paper with crayon scribbles, and 1 faded photograph. Three girls in matching overalls holding juice boxes standing beside a yellow truck. No one had ever reported them missing. No open cases, no names, just another beginning that ended in a wall. Daniel stared at the photo for a long time. You think they got out? Miles shrugged. I think someone tried to make sure they didn't. The sheriff, a kind-eyed man with a limp and a deep respect for paperwork, let them see the site. Same setup, same drywall over framing that didn't match. This wasn't hidden, he muttered. This was archived. Academic phrase of the day. When patterns emerge across disparate events, the phenomenon ceases to be isolated and becomes systemic, which is a fancy way of saying this wasn't just Vernon. Someone had done this before, maybe is still doing it. The drive back was quiet. Evans stared out the window. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel tighter than usual. Miles sat in the back sketching something in a new red notebook. He wouldn't show them yet. At a rest stop in East Texas, they sat on a picnic bench, splitting a pack of licorice and saying nothing, until Evan finally asked the question out loud. What if we weren't the start and no one had an answer? But here's your aging wisdom moment. The moment you realize your trauma is part of a pattern, something in you shifts. It stops being just yours. And that hurts, but it also means you're not crazy. You're connected. They brought the box home to Elaine. She cataloged its contents like a curator at a museum no one asked to build. Then she did something unexpected. She placed it beside the original crate, not in a closet, not in storage, in the living room, right beneath the window where the morning light could find it. These stories belong in the light, she said, even the unfinished ones. And from there, something started. Daniel drafted a website, Unfinished Crates. Evan designed the logo, 3 lines forming a triangle, a fourth just barely touching the edge. Miles wrote the first post. We weren't supposed to be found, but we were. Maybe you are too. They didn't advertise, didn't do interviews, but the stories came anyway. Emails, tips, photographs of other crates, other photos, anonymous messages with partial addresses. One came from Oregon, another from Arkansas. One sent from a burner email simply read, I was Jonah once. She called me that, but my name is Theo. Elaine read every message. She replied to each one. She never said the word survivor. She always said returned, because that's what her boys were. Not just saved, not broken, returned. Quirky fact, the human body replaces almost every cell over a span of 7 years, except for certain parts of your heart and brain. You become someone new. But the core of the memories, they remain. They wait. One night, Daniel got a call from a woman in Kansas. Her brother had vanished in 1993, last seen near a church retreat in the woods. No police report ever stuck. No follow-up. But she had a photograph. 3 boys. One of them looked eerily familiar. Daniel stared at the image, holding it at arm's length, then closer, then back again. That's the kid who used to share my room, he said quietly. For 2 weeks, I thought I dreamed him. The woman cried over the phone, and for the first time, Daniel cried with fear. Not for himself, but because he could finally give someone else what no one gave him: confirmation. The next day, Evan started drawing portraits. Dozens of them. Kids in caps, kids on swings, kids with shadows behind them. He hung them in the community center, calling the exhibit Still Here. Miles started teaching kids how to write their names in bubble letters. It's a weird trick, he said, but it makes them smile. And Elaine, she planted a 5th rose bush. Not red, not gold, white. For the ones who haven't come home yet, she said. She didn't say if, she said yet, because the world was full of walls. And behind some of them, someone might still be waiting. Someone with a shoebox, a crayon, a name they have almost forgotten. Publicly debated phrase for this chapter. What has been hidden in shame can be reclaimed in story. That's what they were doing now. Not just surviving, but building a map for others to follow. The letters started arriving in envelopes, real ones, paper, stamps, no return address. Elaine received the first on a rainy Thursday. Inside, a drawing of 3 figures holding hands. The words, "We remember," in shaky pencil, and a Polaroid of a hallway with green tiles and a bright red door. Daniel stared at it for a long time. I've been there, he whispered. That night, he called Detective Kwan. They scanned the image, cross-referenced architectural styles, found a match. An abandoned youth facility in Missouri, shut down in 1990 after a fire. No records of what happened to the last group of kids housed there. Evan pulled the photo closer. I think this was the room with the stickers, he said. The ones they let us decorate before they made us switch names. Miles didn't speak. He just stood, left the table, and returned with a marker. He circled a shape in the photo, a reflection in the tile. A shoe. Small, torn at the toe. There's someone still there, he said. They packed that night. Elaine didn't protest. She just handed Daniel a thermos of soup and kissed his cheek. Be careful, she said. Be loud, she added. And so they went. The building in Missouri wasn't a facility anymore. It was a skeleton. Half of it burned, half buried in kudzu and time. But the red door, still there, faded but intact. They broke the lock. Inside, scorched linoleum, cracked windows, graffiti scrawled over forgotten signs. But there was something else. Footsteps, not theirs. They froze. Then a voice. Don't come closer. Female, young, wary. Daniel stepped forward slowly. It's okay, he said. We're not here to hurt you. I know who you are, she said. I saw you. In the paper. The triplets, Evan blinked. What's your name? Pause. Then they called me Amber. But I think my real name was Sophie. Miles stepped into the light. Can we come in? Silence. Then the door creaked open further. She was older than they expected. Maybe 20, maybe more. Dirty hoodie, sharp eyes, holding a crowbar like it was an extension of her spine. You really made it out, she said. I didn't think anyone ever did. Aging wisdom moment. The longer someone's been alone, the quieter their survival gets. They sat on the floor, ate granola bars, drank bottled water. Sophie or Amber told them her story. Taken at 6, renamed at 7, rehoused at 8, escaped at 12, been hiding ever since. I stayed close, she said, in case someone came looking. Daniel showed her the red notebook. She laughed sharp, real. I had one of those. They made us draw dreams. Told us if we filled a whole book, we'd get to go home. Did you? Miles asked. She looked at him like he was kidding. Then I buried mine. Behind the fence. Under the peach tree. They found it the next morning. Still sealed in a plastic bag, teeth marks on the corner, probably raccoons. Inside drawings, 3 girls, one tall one with a cane, one with pigtails. A page labeled Us, Before. Elaine flew out the next day. She met Sophie on the porch of the motel, offered tea, offered silence. Sophie cried for the first time. That night, they added her photo to the wall in the Cooper living room. Right above the fireplace, Evan wrote her name below it in soft looping script Sophie found. Quirky fact, some languages have a single word that means a person returned from the woods. Finnish does. So does Icelandic. In English, we just say home. Over the next few weeks, more letters came, always from different places, always with one thing in common. Red jackets, photos, sketches, descriptions. Red not just for visibility, not just because of the boys. Red had been part of the system. Daniel realized it first. It was a marker. For control, like a uniform. They went back through the photos theirs and others sent in, and they saw it: red shirts, red shoes, red ribbons, red walls. A thread, a code. Detective Kwan confirmed it. The FBI opened a case file under Pattern Disappearance's red tag protocol. It was real now, official, and still ongoing. Elaine printed every letter, filed every story, hung each drawing in the hall. We don't know all their names, she said, but we will. Publicly debated academic phrase for this chapter. Collective testimony as resistance. They weren't just healing now. They were documenting, mapping, unerasing. That fall, the family held a gathering, not a memorial, not a press event, just a gathering. 23 people came, all with stories that rhymed in terrible, quiet ways. Elaine stood in front of them under the gold and white rose bushes and said, "This is your house now, too." They lit candles, not to mourn, but to mark the path. And every flame stayed lit even in the wind. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting long shadows on the lawn, where the rose bushes stood in neat rows, red, gold, white, and now new ones, too. Lavender for the unknown, blue for the still lost. each one planted by someone who once had no place to belong. The gathering had started with 23. By the next month, it had doubled. People came from states they didn't talk about, brought photos they couldn't explain, sat around picnic tables and spoke in fragments and glances in the hush of shared grief. No one needed to finish their sentences. The Coopers just nodded, listened, offered sweet tea and sandwiches, let silence stretch when it needed to. That was the first real rule of the house. You don't need to tell the whole story to be heard. Evan built a small outdoor stage in the backyard. He called it the platform, but Daniel teased him endlessly. It's just two pallets and a spotlight. Evan didn't care. On Thursdays, people stood up and read poems, told jokes, played music. Some talked about the barns, the crates, the doors that lock from the outside. Some didn't. Miles said, "You don't owe your pain to the room. But if you give it, it stays here, not with you." Aging wisdom check-in. The longer you live, the more you realize healing is not a finish line. It's a folding chair someone offers you when you finally stop walking. Sophie, the girl from Missouri, moved in with Elaine, started helping in the garden, labeled everything, made spreadsheets for watering schedules. She was, as Miles put it, exactly the kind of person you want during the apocalypse. She told Elaine one day, "I always wondered what kind of mom I would have had." Elaine smiled. "You're looking at her." Sophie cried for a second time. They began organizing crates, literally. A wall of them in the old garage, each marked with a year estate initials if known. Red shoelaces tied to the handles. Miles called it the archive. Daniel called it the evidence. Evan, of course, painted it. They weren't just collecting stories anymore. They were building a case. The FBI showed up again, this time with intention, with boxes, with black coffee and legal pads. Detective Kwan stood in Elaine's kitchen with a look that didn't belong to someone who thought her job was just paperwork. She said, "We think there's more than a dozen operatives, maybe more. Spread out, years of movement. Someone ran logistics. This wasn't random." Elaine didn't flinch. She nodded. "So we find them, and that became the new mission. Find the ones still missing, find the ones who took them, but not to punish, not just that, to end it." Academic phrase of the night, trauma reclamation communities function as both restorative and investigative bodies in the absence of institutional immediacy, which is just a long way of saying, when no one came to help, they built a home, then turned it into headquarters. Evan created an online submission portal. Do you remember a red jacket? Do you have photos you can't explain? Do you know your name now, but not then? Within a week, they had 300 responses. A girl from Canada remembered her sister humming the same four-note tune in the dark for weeks. A man from Georgia then had a scar shaped like a lowercaser and no idea who gave it to him. A nurse from Ohio remembered seeing the same faces in child after child, always renamed, always quiet. The platform became a lifeline. And one night, as a soft rain tapped against the roof of the community center they'd rented for overflow meetings, Daniel stood up and said, "You don't have to remember everything. You just have to believe it happened." People cried, not loud, not messy, just enough to wash a piece of themselves clean. Quirky fact. In ancient cultures, salt was used to purify not just wounds, but memory. People would sit near the sea and speak their pain into the wind. That's what this house had become. A place where people came to speak to the wind, and the wind listened. Elaine received a letter that week, postmarked from a small town in Utah. Inside, a drawing of a treehouse, 3 initials T plus G plus SM, and a note, "I don't remember my last name. But I remember the climbing rope. I remember someone calling me Tuesday. I remember a woman with kind hands who smelled like rosemary. If that was you, thank you." Elaine folded the letter. She didn't cry. She went outside, walked to the rose garden, and planted a new bush, this one pale pink. For Tuesday, she said softly, publicly debated phrase of the night. In long silences, the truth is not lost, only waiting. They weren't waiting anymore. They were knocking on walls, and some of those walls were starting to open. It happened quietly. No sirens, no raids, no spotlights sweeping across midnight barns. Just a name, a face, a key. A retired postal worker in Arizona recognized a man from one of the community's online sketches, a drawing Evan had done from 5 secondhand memories in a dream. "He used to rent a P.O. box across from mine," she wrote. Said he worked with youth outreach, always wore gloves, always smelled like turpentine. His real name, Thomas Vexler, but he had others. Mason, Hale, Fielding, all aliases tied together by slight variations in signature, like the same hand trying to forget itself. FBI agents picked him up outside a bus terminal. He didn't resist, didn't even blink. Guess it took longer than I thought, he said. That night, Elaine sat in her kitchen, holding the news in both hands like a baby bird. The boys gathered silently around her. She said nothing at first, then one down. It wasn't joy or relief, just acknowledgement, and in a strange way that was more powerful. Ding wisdom moment, closure isn't a bang. It's a breath, one you didn't know you were holding until it leaves. Daniel stepped outside, walked to the archive, found the folder labeled Unknown Mail A, Desert Crate number 2. He pulled it. Evan watched him, said, "That's not him." "I know," Daniel replied, "but someone will be." They spent that weekend reorganizing everything, cross-referencing handwriting, voice patterns, rituals. This wasn't a story anymore. It was a blueprint. Gabriel Miles began building a database, a living map of all the stories connected by keywords, colors, symbols. He called it Threadline. "It's a lot of red," he murmured one night scrolling. Too much red. The platform still going strong, now with more people standing up than seats available. One night, a girl named Chloe pulled up her sleeve and showed a faded scar in the shape of a spiral. Daniel gasped. Evan whispered, "That's the mark from the fence, the one at the Missouri house." The connections were tightening, not to a person, to a network. A week later, Elaine received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Cooper," the voice asked. "My name is Felix. I was called Wednesday. I think we were in the same place. I think I was supposed to be your son's replacement." She didn't flinch. She invited him to visit. When he arrived, tall, hollow-cheeked, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big, Elaine opened the door and said, "We've set a place for you." He cried in the doorway for 15 minutes before speaking. Later that night, Daniel sat with him on the porch swing. Felix said, "They told me I had to be Evan, that Evan had died, that if I didn't do it right, the real mom would come and take me away." Daniel said she would have, but not for that reason. They both laughed, softly. The next morning, Elaine added another rosebush, orange, for those who filled in even when it wasn't fair. Quirky fact. Some species of roses can live for centuries. The oldest one still blooms in Germany, growing from a church wall since the year 815. Roots deeper than memory, stronger than fire. That's what Elaine's garden was now. A record, a resurrection, a message. To the lost, you were never erased. To the found, you were never alone. And to the ones still hiding behind drywall photos and aliases. We are coming, not with vengeance, with names, with hands, with truth. Publicly debated academic phrase for tonight. Narrative reclamation as intergenerational immunity. When one survivor speaks, another survives. That's how it works now. The house isn't quiet anymore. It's filled with voices, laughter, hammering from Miles's latest fixer-upper project, Evan cursing softly at his printer, Daniel humming in the kitchen, and Elaine always in the garden tending, naming, remembering. The wind moves through the bushes, brushing petals and stories alike. Not a graveyard, not a museum, a beginning. The house is quiet now, not the kind of silence that used to haunt it, the one filled with missing footsteps and unanswered questions. This is a different silence, the kind that follows a long breath and hand released a burden shared. Outside, the rose bushes sway gently in the evening air. Their colors blend in the low light, red, gold, white, pink, orange. A garden grown from memory, yes, but also from choice. Each one planted not to mourn, but to mark a return. Inside, the boys and men now sleep like they did when they were 7, curled on couches, Miles halfway off a futon, Evan with a sketchbook still open on his chest, Daniel with his hand hanging off the edge of the bed, fingers twitching like he's chasing something in a dream. Lane walks the hallway barefoot. She stops at the photo wall, runs her fingers along each frame. Some faces she knows by name, others not yet, but they are all hers now, all part of the truth she has decided will not stay buried. In the kitchen, a single light glows. On the table, a letter unopened, a drawing unfinished, a cup of tea gone cold. And still the feeling of warmth, of lives not just restored but reimagined, of silence turned into testimony, of walls pulled open not to expose but to invite. You've been here a while now, listening, holding space with us. And maybe tonight when you turn out your own lights and settle into the quiet, you'll hear it too. That faint whisper in the leaves, a voice saying, "We came back. We remember, we're still here. Now sleep, friend. The story can rest."